The year is 1943. In the burning sands of Tunisia, American troops, young, untested, and full of confidence, face the battle that will strip them of their illusions. The desert wind carries not just dust, but the harsh lessons of war. This is the story of the Battle of Kasserine Pass, America's early defeat. Hello and welcome back to Forgotten WW2 Archives, where we uncover the untold and the unforgettable moments of World War II. Today, we travel deep into North Africa, where the United States faced its first major ground confrontation with the battle-hardened German Afrika Korps, and learned that victory would demand more than courage. Main narrative begins. The North African campaign was entering its crucial phase in early 1943. After the Allied landings in Operation Torch, American forces under General Dwight D. Eisenhower began moving eastward, pushing toward Tunisia. The plan was to trap the Axis forces between the British Eighth Army, advancing from Egypt, and the newly arrived American and Free French troops from Algeria. On paper, it looked like a perfect pincer movement. But war rarely follows the map. In the interior of Tunisia lay a harsh, mountainous landscape, ridges, deep valleys, and narrow passes carved by centuries of wind. One of these was Kasserine Pass, a broad gap between two mountain ranges. It would become the proving ground for the young American army. The soldiers were mostly inexperienced. Many had never even seen combat before. Their uniforms still carried the fresh smell of new fabric. Their weapons gleamed in the sunlight, and their hearts were filled with confidence that they would easily defeat the enemy. But the Germans were waiting. Under the command of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, Axis forces had regrouped after their retreat from El Alamein. Rommel's men were veterans, disciplined, cunning, and merciless. His panzers had rolled across Africa for nearly 2 years, crushing British lines and dancing across the desert with mechanical precision. Against them now stood the untested U.S. Roman II Corps, led by Major General Lloyd Fredendall. Externally, the American positions seemed organized a series of defensive outposts, sandbagged artillery points, and supply depots stretching across the Tunisian desert. But beneath that order was confusion. Communications were weak, intelligence was poor, and coordination with British allies was frustratingly slow. Fredendall, known for his eccentric leadership, operated from a distant headquarters hidden in a mountain cave miles away from the front. He issued orders in cryptic language, often confusing even his own officers. Inside those American camps, morale wavered between nervous excitement and growing unease. The soldiers, many from small towns in the Midwest, had heard stories about Rommel, about how he could strike from nowhere. They stared at the endless horizon of sand and stone, knowing the enemy could be watching them through binoculars at that very moment. The first signs of disaster began on February 14, 1943. Valentine's Day in Tunisia was no day for love. It was the day the Germans struck. At dawn, a thunderous roar shattered the silence as Panzer tanks surged forward through the Fade Pass, cutting through American lines with ruthless efficiency. The 21st Panzer Division advanced with deadly speed, their shells tearing through thin-skinned American M3 tanks. Within hours, several American units were overrun. Externally, the battlefield was chaos, explosions echoing through the mountains, smoke plumes curling into the orange sky, trucks ablaze, and soldiers scattering for cover. The desert floor was littered with shattered helmets, burning vehicles, and broken rifles. The interior experience was far worse: panic, confusion, and disbelief. Soldiers who had once marched proudly now crouched behind rocks, clutching their rifles, wondering if they'd survive the next minute. Rommel saw his opportunity. Though technically recovering from illness and under orders to rest, he personally took charge of the offensive. His objective, to punch through the American lines, seize Kasserine Pass, and reach the Allied rear areas, possibly even threatening the supply base at Tebessa. If he could do that, he might shatter the Allied front entirely. The Americans, caught off guard, scrambled to reorganize. General Fredendall's fragmented commands came too late and too unclear. At the front, junior officers and non-commissioned leaders tried to hold the line. Many of them fought bravely, often without proper support or coordination, but bravery alone couldn't stop the tide of steel that was rolling toward them. Inside the cockpit of a German panzer, the world was mechanical precision gears shifting smoothly, commands shouted in sharp German, gunners scanning for targets through periscopes. Outside, the desert sun glared against the metal hulls, turning the tanks into glinting beasts of war. They advanced relentlessly, crushing resistance beneath their treads. By February 19th, the Germans had reached Kasserine Pass itself, a rugged gateway, flanked by steep, rocky slopes. American engineers had hastily set up roadblocks and gun positions. Machine guns rattled, anti-tank guns fired desperately, and artillery boomed from the hillsides. The desert air vibrated with the violence of the clash. Inside the American lines, young soldiers huddled in foxholes, shouting over the roar of engines. The smell of cordite and oil hung heavy in the air. "Hold your ground," shouted officers, their voices barely audible over the shellfire. Some men obeyed, others broke and fled. It was not cowardice, it was chaos. From his forward observation post, Rommel watched through binoculars as his forces pressed on. He respected the Americans' spirit but saw their weakness, their lack of coordination, their poor positioning, their inexperience. To him, it was an opportunity to teach a brutal lesson. That night, as darkness fell over the desert, the sounds of battle faded to the crackling of fires and the moans of the wounded. The stars above Kasserine Pass shone cold and indifferent, witnesses to the suffering below. Medics moved quietly among the fallen, their flashlights flickering like tiny stars on the ground. In the American command posts, tension was unbearable. Reports were confusing, radios were jammed, and officers argued about where the main attack would strike next. Some units were completely cut off, others retreating without orders. It was a moment of reckoning for an army that had believed victory would be simple. The Battle of Kasserine Pass was far from over, but already the seeds of defeat were taking root. And for the young United States Army, the lessons learned in those scorching sands would shape everything that followed. As dawn broke over the barren ridges of Kasserine Pass, the sky turned from a soft pink to a blazing gold. The desert looked calm from a distance, but that calm was deceptive. Beneath the rising sun lay wreckage burn, stout jeeps, twisted steel, and the bodies of men who had fought through the night. The acrid scent of fuel and gunpowder still clung to the morning air. Inside the American lines, the situation was unraveling fast. Units were scattered, ammunition was running low, and communications between divisions were unreliable. Soldiers dug in wherever they could behind rocks, broken vehicles, or makeshift trenches, waiting for orders that often never came. The sense of confusion was overwhelming. For many, it was their first real taste of war, and it was far harsher than they had imagined. Externally, the battlefield stretched out like a painting of destruction. Long columns of black smoke rose into the sky. German armored divisions moved like predators, silent and efficient, their tanks advancing in perfect formation. The sound of their engines echoed through the valley, deep, mechanical growls that filled the air with dread. Rommel's men had already breached the initial American defenses, and now the Desert Fox was determined to finish the job. Rommel himself was in his element. Standing near his command car, binoculars pressed to his eyes, he watched the battle unfold like a chess game. His voice was calm as he issued orders to his staff officers. Every move was calculated, every attack precise. He knew that this victory would not only weaken the Americans, but also boost the morale of his weary Axis troops. In stark contrast, General Fredendall, the American commander, operated miles away in his underground headquarters. Buried in a concrete bunker carved into the side of a mountain, he gave orders through radio channels that often misunderstood his cryptic commands. His men referred to him as a man hiding from his own war. He never set foot near the front lines, and his lack of presence was deeply felt among his troops. Inside that bunker, surrounded by maps and static, filled radios, Fredendall believed he was controlling the situation. Outside, the truth was very different. In the forward lines, American soldiers tried desperately to hold their ground. Many of them showed extraordinary courage. At isolated outposts, artillerymen continued firing until their guns overheated. Infantry units, outnumbered and outgunned, fought tooth and nail to delay the German advance. But they were fighting blind without proper coordination. They had no idea where the enemy was strongest or where reinforcements were needed. By February 20th, the Germans launched another powerful assault, spearheaded by Panzer Roman IV and supported by elite infantry. The Americans tried to respond with their M4 Shermans and M3 Stuarts, but their tanks were thinly armored compared to the German steel beasts. Shells tore through their lines. Each explosion sent shockwaves across the valley, lifting sand and metal into the air. The roar of engines mixed with the screams of men and the thunder of artillery, a symphony of chaos. Inside those tanks, American crews fought with determination. They reloaded under fire, their hands shaking, sweat dripping into their eyes. Many tanks were hit, but still they fired back, refusing to give up. For some, bravery became a last stand. The exterior world was a blur of smoke, fire, and sandstorms kicked up by explosions. The interior was fear raw, suffocating fear mixed with courage that refused to die quietly. By evening, the German spearhead had penetrated deep into Kasserine Pass. American positions crumbled one after another. In the confusion, entire battalions were forced to retreat. Trucks raced down the narrow mountain roads, carrying the wounded and the shaken survivors. Some units became lost, retreating in the wrong direction, straight into enemy fire. Rommel pressed on relentlessly. His goal was clear, to reach the Allied supply base at Tebessa and cut off their lifeline. But as night fell again, he faced a critical decision. His troops were advancing quickly, but his supply lines were stretched thin. Fuel and ammunition were running low, and his men had been fighting without rest for days. Even the most disciplined army can't fight forever without supplies. Meanwhile, in the American camps farther to the west, reinforcements were arriving. General Eisenhower, shocked by the reports from the front, ordered urgent support to stabilize the situation. Among the new arrivals was General George S. Patton, a man whose name would soon become legendary. But at this stage he had not yet taken command. He was still observing, analyzing, learning. The American leadership was beginning to realize that their army was unprepared for the realities of modern warfare. Inside the minds of the soldiers who survived the first assaults, something was changing. The shock and fear were giving way to grim determination. They had seen death up close. They had lost friends, brothers, leaders. The desert had humbled them, but it had also hardened them. No one spoke much that night around the small fires that flickered in the darkness. The silence was heavy, broken only by the distant rumble of artillery and the occasional cry of a wounded man echoing through the valley. In the German camps there was a different mood, one of quiet confidence. Rommel's men believed they were on the verge of breaking through. Around campfires, officers studied maps while soldiers cleaned their weapons. Their morale was high, but even among them, fatigue was setting in. The relentless desert wind carried fine sand into everything: food, rifles, even their lungs. The exterior might have looked victorious, but inside, exhaustion gnawed at every man. By February 21st, Rommel's forces clashed with a newly organized American defensive line near Jebel el Hamra. Here, for the first time, the Americans began to show signs of adaptation. Under heavy attack, they held their positions more effectively, using artillery to target German tanks and ambush points. The shelling was intense, and for the first time in days, German forces began to slow down. The terrain worked in the Americans' favor. Narrow ridges and rocky slopes limited the movement of Rommel's tanks. It became a brutal slugging match, with artillery echoing across the hills. The Germans still inflicted heavy losses, but their advance was no longer unstoppable. In the chaos, acts of heroism unfolded everywhere. Medics crawled under fire to drag the wounded to safety. Engineers blew up bridges to delay enemy tanks. Pilots from the U.S. Army Air Forces swooped down from the sky, strafing enemy columns, risking everything to protect their comrades on the ground. Rommel, watching from a ridge, realized the truth. His offensive had reached its limit. His men were exhausted, his supplies dangerously low, and reinforcements were not coming. He had achieved a tactical victory, but strategically, it would not be enough to break the Allied front. Inside his command vehicle, Rommel studied his maps under the dim light of a lantern. His face, usually confident, showed a trace of frustration. He knew he had taught the Americans a harsh lesson, but he also sensed that these young soldiers would learn from it quickly. The Battle of Kasserine Pass had shown him their weaknesses, but it had also revealed their potential. As darkness fell once again, both sides prepared for what would come next. The Americans were bloodied, but not broken. They were learning, adapting, and preparing to strike back. The desert had taken its toll, but it had also forged something new: an army that was beginning to understand what it truly meant to fight the Germans. The morning of February 22, 1943, dawned cold and gray over the Kasserine Valley. The smoke of battle hung in the air like a shroud, veiling the scorched earth and broken metal that littered the landscape. The cries of the wounded had faded to silence, replaced by the low, distant hum of engines and the faint echo of sporadic gunfire. The once confident American army now stood at a crossroads, humiliated, shaken, but still alive. Inside the American lines, commanders struggled to rebuild their shattered formations. Messages from Eisenhower's headquarters were urgent and decisive. The line must hold at all costs. Reinforcements were being rushed forward. British, French, and American units moving through treacherous mountain roads under constant threat of air attack. Among them were fresh troops who looked upon the wreckage with silent horror, realizing what kind of war they had entered. The Americans had learned bitter lessons in just a few days. They now dug deeper trenches, established better communication, and coordinated their defenses with their British allies more closely. In the heart of the chaos, a new determination was forming, a quiet, grim resolve that they would never let such a disaster happen again. Externally, the desert still belonged to Rommel's forces. His panzers, though battered, continued to probe the American defenses. Columns of dust marked the movement of his tanks as they maneuvered around the narrow passes, seeking one more breakthrough. Yet behind the confident exterior, cracks were beginning to form. His fuel trucks were nearly empty, his ammunition stocks dangerously low, and his men exhausted from constant fighting. The long supply lines from the north coast of Africa were under constant Allied air attack. Rommel knew the moment of opportunity was closing. Inside his command car, he leaned over his maps, tracing the ridges and valleys with a gloved finger. His eyes, sharp and calculating, betrayed a hint of fatigue. "We've gone as far as we can," he murmured to his aide. "Any further, and we'll risk losing everything." He had seen the signs of Allied recovery, the reorganized defenses, the increasing air presence, and the stubborn resistance that had replaced the earlier confusion. By February 23rd, the Americans began to fight back with a new sense of order. Artillery batteries, now better positioned, opened fire with deadly accuracy. The ground shook under the thunder of their shells. The once disorganized defensive lines had become coordinated zones of resistance. Air support from P-38 Lightnings and British Spitfires roared overhead, strafing German supply convoys and bombing tank formations. The skies that had once favored the Axis now belonged to the Allies. Inside the foxholes, American soldiers fought with renewed spirit. They had been bloodied, humiliated, and terrified, but something inside them had hardened. They were no longer the inexperienced troops who had entered Tunisia full of blind confidence. They were now soldiers forged by fire. They held their positions with a determination that surprised even their own officers. On the slopes of Jebel el Hamra, German tanks advanced once more, their treads grinding against the rocky terrain. But this time, American anti-tank guns were ready. Hidden in camouflaged positions, they opened fire in synchronized volleys. Explosions tore through the German armor columns, turning several panzers into blazing wrecks. The Germans pressed forward, but every yard was paid for in blood and steel. Inside the cockpit of a P-38 Lightning flying above the battlefield, the pilot banked hard, diving through enemy flak. Below, he could see the narrow valley choked with smoke and dust. He pressed the trigger, his guns spitting fire as tracers ripped through German trucks. The pilot's heart pounded, but he stayed on target, determined to protect the soldiers on the ground. The exterior world below him was chaos, but inside his cockpit, focus and purpose burned bright. Rommel realized the tide was turning. His troops were still superior tactically, but the strategic situation was collapsing. Without fuel and with Allied reinforcements pouring in, continuing the offensive meant risking encirclement. Reluctantly, he made the decision to pull back. On February 24th, German forces began to withdraw through the Kasserine Pass, covered by rearguard units who fought fiercely to slow the Allied pursuit. The retreat was methodical, the mark of an army that knew how to survive even in retreat. Rommel's men destroyed bridges, mined roads, and booby-trapped abandoned vehicles to delay the Allies. The Americans advanced cautiously, wary of traps. For the first time in days, the thunder of battle began to fade, replaced by the low rumble of engines and the distant echo of artillery fading into the horizon. As the smoke cleared, the true cost of the battle became evident. The Americans had suffered heavy casualties over 0 killed, wounded, or captured. Scores of tanks and vehicles lay scattered across the valley. The Germans, though victorious in the short term, had also paid dearly. Their offensive had failed to achieve its ultimate objective. Inside the American command, the mood was somber but resolute. General Eisenhower ordered a full review of the battle, demanding to know what had gone wrong. Findings were harsh. Poor leadership, inadequate training, weak coordination, and overconfidence had all contributed to the disaster. But rather than break the Army's spirit, the defeat became the catalyst for change. General Lloyd Fredendall was relieved of his command. In his place came General George S. Patton, a fiery, disciplined commander who believed in order, aggression, and accountability. Patton wasted no time reshaping the Army. He demanded rigorous training, tighter discipline, and absolute respect for the chain of command. He visited the front lines personally, inspecting defenses, talking to soldiers, and inspiring them with his fierce presence. "We're not retreating," he told them. "We're just advancing in a different direction." Under Patton's leadership, the U.S. Roman II Corps began to transform. Morale rose, confidence returned, and coordination with British and French forces improved dramatically. Within weeks, the same soldiers who had fled in confusion at Kasserine, were fighting with renewed precision and strength. The lessons of their early defeat became the foundation of their future victories. Externally, the North African landscape bore the scars of war: burned vehicles half buried in sand, wrecked tanks rusting under the sun, and grave markers scattered across the valley. But inside the hearts of those who had survived, something powerful had been born: the understanding that war demanded more than courage. It demanded unity, discipline, and resilience. Rommel, meanwhile, returned to Germany for medical leave. Though he remained one of the most respected commanders of the war, he knew that the sands of Africa were slipping from his grasp. Within months, the Axis forces in North Africa would be pushed back relentlessly, finally surrendering in May 1943. Kasserine Pass had been his last true victory on the continent. For the Americans, it was a turning point, their first great lesson in modern warfare. From that defeat emerged a new kind of soldier, and a new kind of army, one that would go on to storm the beaches of Normandy, fight through the hedgerows of France, and liberate Europe from tyranny. As the sun set once more over the Kasserine Pass, the winds of the desert whispered through the wreckage, a silent reminder of the price of inexperience and the cost of learning through blood. The battle had been lost, but its legacy would shape the victories yet to come. And so, in those rugged Tunisian hills, the young American army found its identity, forged in failure, tempered in courage, and destined for greatness. And that's the forgotten story of the Battle of Kasserine Pass, America's early defeat. A battle that began in humiliation but ended in transformation. Thank you for watching Forgotten WW2 Archives. If you found this story powerful, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, because history should never be forgotten.